Kathleen Stock, a philosophy professor targeted by activists for her views on gender self-identification, has said she fears for her career at Sussex University. She says that it has been effectively ended by a union's call for an investigation into transphobia. Her case is the latest in a series of worrying trends on university campuses. At Exeter, a pro-life society has become embroiled in a freedom of speech row, with many students accusing the university of providing a platform for hate speech. Joining me is journalist and assistant editor of Spiked Online, Ella Whelan, Madeleine Page, who is the CEO of the Alliance of Pro-Life Students, and lawyer and former prosecutor Jeremiah Ignabole. Thank you all for joining me today. I'll come to you first, Madeleine, if that's OK. Can you maybe tell us a bit about what's going on campus at Exeter and who is involved?
Yes, so at Exeter University, there was a post on an anonymous sort of confession Facebook page alerting the students to the fact that the Pro-Life Society existed. Off the back of that, they started a petition that now has over 9,000 signatures to get the society removed, and also encouraging people to comment on their Facebook page, their Instagram page, basically trying to shut them down. So they've now had a lot of serious abuse, including death threats. We've had one of the people on the committee told that if he's not careful, he's going to end up at the bottom of the quay.
Is there anything that the university are doing about this? Because this sounds like a horrific sort of failure of duty of care, really.
Yes, so they came out with I would say, quite a soft statement in support of free speech. So they have come out in support of free speech, which is positive. I would have liked to have seen it a bit harsher than it was.
Yes. OK. Jeremiah, can I bring you in here? Because obviously you know about the legal situation. Where do the students stand on legal grounds, having to run a group that they want to run, but is potentially provocative or perceived that way?
Yes, well, the university has a duty to take reasonably practicable steps to ensure that freedom of speech is protected on its premises. So that looks like making sure, for example, if there are intimidating or harassing viewpoints or actions being taken against a pro-life society, that there are reasonable activities to make sure that those students are protected.
Yes.
Potentially, that's within the ambit of their duty.
But then what is the government trying to do? Because they're now introducing extra measures in universities to protect freedom of speech, which must be different from the current regulations. Is that right? Absolutely.
And the government's introduction of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill is a very welcome introduction, in my view. It does three things. The first thing is it puts a specific duty on the university to promote freedom of speech, then protect freedom of speech, and also the student union. And that's a new aspect as well. So previously, student unions were governed by essentially charity law alone, but they now also have this duty to make sure that they take active steps to protect freedom of speech as well.
Ella, can I bring you in here? Because what do you think about this idea of the government effectively saying, we're going to ban you from banning people? Which is kind of what the legislation is, isn't it? Is there a contradiction there?
There is a contradiction there, and I think one of the things that we've lost is a sense that, in particular, political societies or whatever pro-life society wants to characterise itself as, is meant to be part of the rough and tumble of campus culture. You know, if you're going to put forward a position, political position, moral position, and campaign around it, you have to expect some level of pushback. And indeed, pro-choicers have failed in their defence of freedom. You know, the central tenets of having a pro-choice position is that you believe in freedom and freedom of choice. To then come out with this censorious move to essentially try to cancel the different side of you and pro-lifers is very disappointing. But I always get a bit nervous, or, to put it strongly, I get disappointed. And I used to be, I was a student at Sussex many moons ago, at this push to formalise law around what should be a free-flowing and at sometimes tense and sometimes unpredictable life of politics on campus. You know, students don't... I was actually, at the time I was a student, there was the move to change the status of students' unions, which we all thought was a terrible thing because, OK, they are now... they are sort of liable to do certain things around free speech, but you also have university board members breathing down your neck, which means you're not really a union. And essentially, I think what's happened is that students have lost their bottle in being able to debate freely on campus, but also adults, you know, everyone's an adult at university, but I mean the adults in the room in terms of staff and university administration have given up on the idea of university as a place of free ideas, of a place of challenging people. And so you end up with what, governments or lawyers or authorities stepping in. That seems very unsatisfactory.
But I mean, I've read a number of your articles about the abortion debate. You're very much on the pro-choice side. I mean, there must be a sense in which some of Madeleine's perspectives upset you or you think might be too far? I mean, do you think that's a fair thing to say?
I feel very strongly about the position of wanting to campaign to decriminalise abortion, and I think that women's freedom of choice is essential for anyone who's a freedom lover. And I think it's interesting that there's often a blind spot with people who are pro-freedom in many other ways, that they seem to halt when it comes to women's freedom. The crucial thing is that we are meant to be able to, we on the pro-choice side are meant to be able to win this argument well and win it clearly, because what we should be saying is we support your freedom of speech to say whatever you like about your moral point in relation to abortion, your religious point, whatever form it takes.
Yes.
Why don't you support my freedom to do what I want with my life? It's quite an easily won, general public opinion in this country is swaying far in favour of liberalising abortion law. So this is a kind of a manufactured panic, I think, among a couple of pathetic students who can't handle debate.
Do you take this point, Madeleine, that it is perhaps the case that your position, which is the pro-life position, is in a sense an encroachment on someone else's rights, and therefore that's their justification for shutting you down? Do you accept that point of view?
No, because for me, abortion comes down to what the unborn is, and I believe, and science shows, that unborn's a living human being. So I think that's where the discrepancy lies, because I don't see it as hindering a woman's right to freedom, but more actually by having abortion, we're hindering that child's right to life.
But do you have any kind of... I mean, have you spoken to any of the people who have protested against you or tried to engage with them? Have you made any attempt?
Yes, it's very difficult. It's interesting, actually, what Ella was saying. I often find that they'll say there's no point of discussion, there's no need to have this debate. I think pro-choicers seem to think that the debate is won or is finished.
Right.
And I think... And I don't know why, and I'm wondering if this is why we're now having all of this backlash, is I think then seeing there's a lot more pro-life people, the societies are growing, we've doubled over the past couple of years, and I wonder if now it's a panic of, OK, we thought this debate was over, but it's not. And
yes.
We don't know, an unwillingness to engage in it.
It's interesting that both sides here feel that they can win this with the opportunity to do so. But it's going to be difficult if hate speech comes in, Jeremiah, because is it not the case that this conceptualisation of hate speech is in effect a kind of fudge to carve out exceptions for certain forms of speech that certain people just don't like?
Absolutely. What we're seeing is an increasing culture of fear on the campus, whereby even ordinary viewpoints or minority viewpoints are deemed themselves to be violent,
right,
or deemed themselves to be worthy of prohibition. So the issue there is that if you treat legitimate viewpoints as violent in and of themselves, then what we see is a growth of a violent response, which in itself is which is actual crime that needs to be tackled. Where
do you think this has come from, this idea of certain words, certain opinions being tantamount to violence? Well,
I think over time we've seen the kind of encroachment of the redefinition of words in terms of this kind of new approach whereby words don't seem to matter as much. But the reality is that, sticks and stones might break your bones, but redefinition of words can completely shatter fundamental rights, because words have meaning, and meaning kind of imply, and meaning shapes reality. So having clear words and meaning, especially in relation to the gender-critical debate, is important because it has repercussions on fundamental rights.
Yes, I think we've got a graphic here just relating to the protesters. Can we have a look at that? OK, so this is actually the protest. This is the GoFundMe account. And again, you see, it's always about exactly what Jeremiah was saying here, this conflation of words and violence. There are certain opinions that are just beyond the pale. And I think this is a real worry. Do you have any views, Ella, about this idea of the very concept of hate speech? Do you have any ideas about... Because that seems to be now a broadly accepted thing. I talk to people and they say hate speech is different from free speech. Do you accept that point of view?
No, I don't accept it, because speech is speech. And particularly when you try to police, as Jeremiah was kind of pointing out, if you try to police an emotion like hate, it's incredibly subjective. So, indeed, if you take the pro-life or what I would call anti-choice position, the words that are used on an anti-choice protest are very different on the public square of the campus where, anyone can shout what they like. And they take on a different meaning when protesters shout them at women who are going into abortion clinics, for example.
Right.
Words are flexible. Words have different meanings in different contexts, different intonations, different emotions that are fed into them. When you try to start policing that and try to differentiate that, you end up in a completely censorious position because one person's argument is completely different to another's. I think it's really important to have a adult and a mature sense among the pro-choice community and pro-choice campaigners. And I'm very glad to say that, there are many young people who feel very, very strongly about this. that if you're fighting for freedom, it cannot be just for you and not for others.
Yes.
And if you are making a principled, what I would say a very crucial principled position about women's freedom to self-determination and women's ability to make rational decisions about their lives, you then can't, can't say at the same time that women are so pathetic and so cowed that they cannot handle a couple of mad Abort 67 campaigners on Library Square. It just doesn't add up. Either you think women are robust enough to make proper decisions about their lives, which I think feel very strongly that they are, and you can use that argument, or you think that we're weak-willed, which, as it happens, is what the other side thinks.
Do you feel supported, Madeleine, though, by university authorities, and do you think this problem is getting worse just generally?
I think it is getting worse. I think... Do I feel supported? I think some universities are quite good. They do understand where they stand, or what their legal duties are. I think it mainly comes from the students' unions and the students themselves. I think students themselves don't seem to quite understand what can and can't be done. And I think now, unfortunately, their truth and reason doesn't have a place in the debate, and actually people think we can win arguments based on emotion.
Right.
And I think that's what's causing this tension too, is that it's our emotions and our lived experiences that we're trying to use to have this discussion.
Well, there's a real confusion, isn't there? I mean, I was having a discussion with someone on Twitter today who was suggesting that what the protesters in Sussex, for instance, are doing against Professor Stock isn't tantamount to abuse, harassment or threats, even though they're actually sending threats. Surely there's a misunderstanding here. And where do we stand on this, Jeremiah? What do you think?
Well, I think the criminal law on intimidating behaviour and harassment is pretty clear.
Is it? Because I think people are unclear about it. What is the difference between just me robustly objecting and maybe shouting because I disagree with something, and when does that tip over into harassment exactly?
Well, harassment, for there to be harassment, there needs to be a course of conduct. And so a one-off offensive remark doesn't necessarily amount to harassment in and of itself.
Yes.
But intimidating behaviour, that can be judged by whether or not somebody's in imminent threat of harm.
That's the how you define it.
Yeah, well,
that's
that for intimidating behaviour, which essentially amounts to an assault.
Okay.
But harassment will need to be targeted, intentional, and have a course of conduct for that to be proved.
Right.
Alternatively, there's, of course, offences under the Communications Act, where if something is grossly offensive,
yes.
Using social media, for example, then that may well be a crime in and of itself.
Can I ask you about that? Because actually, so the hate speech laws in this country seem to be sort of encoded in the Public Order Act of 1986.
Quite.
Communications Act of 2003. And there you say the key phrase, if you post something online that is grossly offensive, that could be a crime. Who gets to decide? Because the legislation doesn't make it clear what that actually means. And isn't that as a former prosecutor, does it not trouble you when legislation is so vague and open to interpretation?
Very much so, very much so. And I think, thankfully, where the legislation is vague, then we have to fall back on the interpretation of judges. And again, that's not necessarily a very predictable thing to do.
Well, they're human beings, right?
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
But that said, we do have the Human Rights Act, which makes sure that speech that is offensive, shocking or disturbing, that is a fundamental right. So even if something is deemed to be insulting, we know that we have those fundamental rights in the Human Rights Act that protect such speech. I would argue that subjectively offensive remarks are considered to be subjective in and of themselves. It does not constitute a crime.
But a lot of people would say that it does. And certainly, if you take the Professor Stock example, people are making the claim that her opinions are the same thing as, and they use the phrase, erasing their existence. But of course, she's not calling for anyone to be erased or to be killed or anything, or any violence whatsoever.
Absolutely. It goes to the heart of this kind of British value, as we call it, of tolerance. We need to have a discussion in this country as to what does tolerance look like? Does it look like cancelling individuals because we consider their views to be wrong?
Yep.
Or does it look like actually hearing the alternative point of view? And I would suggest that it's more tolerant to hear a view that you detest and let it be judged by the merits of the argument than it is to simply cancel it without and make it being essentially judge, jury and executioner before the views actually aired.
And Madeleine, you've been in touch, obviously, as part of your role, as you've been in touch with lots of the students who've been targeted by these various campaigns. How are they reacting to all of this? Are they just quite robust and they're used to it by now? Or is it taking its toll?
It's definitely taking its toll. Some are more robust than others. I think that's what I find difficult too, is that in many senses they do feel victimised, but they don't want to play the victim because otherwise then you're almost being as bad, I think, as some of the other people that are accusing them of this.
Right.
So you sort of end up in this awkward catch-22. But I mean, of course, when someone says that they think that you should have been aborted, I mean, no one enjoys hearing that.
No, that's a very unpleasant thing to say, and that's the kind of thing that they're getting.
Yeah, it was. Some of them, bless them, didn't want to go through all of them, so they'd shared their login details so that we could sort it out for them. And I mean, harrowing. Some of the things, your mum should have had an abortion. I can't believe you're on this planet.
I mean, we did invite one of the protesters to come, and she wouldn't. So I mean, but that's again part of the problem, isn't it, right, Ella? That actually, for some people and for some activists of today, the very concept of debate is a kind of a thing
harm.
we need to... Yeah, a harm, exactly. How do you possibly address that or push back against that? Because unless we can debate, they won't understand our point of view.
Well, it's very difficult because at a university, when students are coming in out of secondary school, relatively young, you're still finding your way politically and you might make some mistakes. But you're meant to have some kind of precedent to look for in the wider adult world for how to deal with debate. And in the case of Kathleen Stock, as I said, I went to Sussex. You're used to fringe kind of mad stuff happening, particularly on Library Square. I probably engaged in a couple of things like that myself when I was younger. The more concerning thing is the response of UCU. Can
you just clarify who that is?
On the union. So the union that is meant to be standing up for academic freedom and staff's rights at a university and staff's freedom to say what they think, very mealy-mouthed condemned the harassment against Kathleen Stock, but spent most of its statement calling for an investigation of transphobia on campus and basically siding with the people who were seeking to intimidate and harass Kathleen Stock. And, what do you say to young people who are trying to get a sense of how you debate properly if institutions that are supposed to be there to protect academic freedom, or indeed, I mean, it was one Vice-Chancellor, Adam Tickell, who came out in defence of Kathleen Stock very robustly, but he's a Vice-Chancellor on his way out, and it makes you ask a question, what other Vice-Chancellors across the UK would do similar things if similar things happened at their universities? There is a real sense of adults in the room having vacated the stage of the cause of free speech. And I think we have to get more serious, if we're really serious about what it is a young generation should have as values, British values like tolerance, for example, we have to give that example.
Do you think, Madeline, that we will get to that position where people will be persuaded that debate is far better than harassment?
I'd like to hope so. I think what Ella was saying made me think more of what concerns me is self-censorship now.
Right.
Is that because we have this cancel culture and fear of abuse, I do worry how many students are deliberately choosing not to say something that they would want to say for fear of the attacks that they may get.
And Jeremiah, just a quick last word to you. Are you hopeful that there's any chance that politicians might push back against hate speech laws, try to see them change so that we don't have this kind of nebulous, vague legislation?
Well, hate speech laws, I think, is probably more in the perception that it is in reality.
Yes.
So hate speech laws in this country tend to focus on a criminal uplift where an already existing offence is motivated by hostility against a protected characteristic.
Yes.
So I think what we do see is some encouraging signs in the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill, which essentially show the government has signalled that we want to make it easier for academics and students to be able to sue universities if they're not fulfilling their duties.
Right.
So I think that's a positive sign in favour of free speech.
OK, well, that's quite an optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much for joining my three guests, ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.